Hey guys, tonight we wander into a time and place that wasn't built for comfort, convenience, or even your basic survival instincts, the Wild West. You trudge through a landscape that's equal parts striking and savage. Cactus needles prick your skin, tumbleweeds skitter wildly across cracked earth, and dry heat hangs thick like an unwelcome blanket. The sun beats down relentless, almost like it's got a personal vendetta against you. You probably won't survive this day out here, but hey, that's part of the twisted charm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your location and the local time in the comments below so we can see where the survivors are tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing where the cracked earth stretches endlessly toward a horizon that seems impossible to reach. A dried-out riverbed yawns to your left, and dusty trails twist away into the distance. The air tastes like burnt sage mixed with a hint of impending danger. This isn't a postcard, it's a testing ground for anyone brave enough to face it. Historians still argue whether the frontier spirit was romanticized or utterly pragmatic survivalism dressed in cowboy boots. Either way, the truth hits hard. The Wild West was brutally unforgiving, especially if you thought it was a scenic adventure. The first day alone is a battleground against the elements. You quickly learn there's no room here for whining or hesitation. Every step burns your soles, every breath pulls grit into your lungs. The sky offers no mercy. The sun, perched high and blazing, demands sweat and sacrifice. Locals in those days would swear by the shade of an old mesquite tree or by slurping cold creek water, luxuries you don't have as the heat sears your skin. It's hotter than a branding iron set to singe your very hopes of survival, and that's just the start. You think about the stories you've heard, quick-draw shootouts, gold rushes, and dusty ghost towns. You realize those tales skip over the dirt and sweat, the bites and bruises, and the kind of exhaustion that dulls your mind. The reality? The West wasn't just a playground for sharpshooters or silver miners. It was a test of your grit, your wits, and often your sheer dumb luck. A little-known fact pops in here. Despite what the movies show, many people actually lived miles apart, isolated beyond imagination, making the nearest neighbor just a faint silhouette on the horizon. Getting help wasn't just inconvenient, sometimes it was impossible. That's where life's fragility really hits home. Even a tiny injury could spiral into something far worse without proper care. Imagine that, your own solitude and the ruthless environment conspiring to keep you down. So, as you stare out into that wide expanse, remember how the wind picks up random clumps of dust and carries them over your skin. It's not just a scenery piece, it's the ever-present reminder that you're a small part of a vast and indifferent world. You didn't get a heads up for the misery waiting in the desert heat, the jagged rocks, or the endless miles of dry dirt. That's why, for all the swaggering and daring that the Wild West inspires, surviving a single day in its raw form was a victory. You probably wouldn't last, not without the kind of knowledge that only those who were born or bred there possessed. But don't worry, we'll walk you through exactly why that is, step by sweat-soaked step. You squint as the sun climbs higher, and the heat wraps itself around you like a thick, suffocating blanket. The sky is an endless blue, not a cloud in sight to offer even the hint of relief. You probably imagine the Wild West as a golden-hued paradise, but the reality bites harder than a rattlesnake. The scorching sun and the relentless dust storms are the real bosses here. You trudge forward, sweat mixing with the fine layer of grit that's already coating your face. Every inhalation scratches your throat. You can taste the dust and dirt, and it sticks like a bad aftertaste. Here's a hardcore fact for you. On average, summer temperatures in the Southwest could soar above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and historians still argue whether early settlers fully understood just how much the climate could break them before they even reached town. The sun wasn't just an annoyance, it was a brutal enemy, draining moisture and energy faster than you can blink. You think cool breezes would save you? Nope. They quickly turn into dust storms swirling from nowhere, whipping sand and debris at your exposed skin like microscopic daggers. Now, imagine a dust storm rolling in suddenly, a wall of swirling dirt and chaotic debris that blinds you and clogs your mouth, nose, and eyes. Settlers called these cyclone dusts, and they could last for hours. There are accounts of whole days spent hunkered down, hoping the dirt wouldn't smother everything, including the fragile new crops and the scant livestock. Dust storms were so frequent and violent that some historians debate whether they played as significant a role in shaping settlement patterns as anything else. What's weirdly fascinating is that in some desperate attempts to shield themselves, pioneers crafted rudimentary goggles or covered their faces with makeshift bandanas soaked in water, hoping to trap some moisture. This might seem like a clever trick today, but it wouldn't have stopped severe dehydration or the damage just waiting to happen beneath that blazing sun. Here's a quirky tidbit that's both hilarious and deadly. Some settlers reportedly used a bizarre method of spreading crocodile dung, yes, real crocodile dung, as a homemade sunscreen. It sounds absolutely absurd now, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Unfortunately, the effectiveness of such natural remedies was about as reliable as a leaky wagon wheel. Not only did it stink, but it also did little to save their skin from burning. The sun's relentless glare messes with your vision too. You start to see mirages, what looks like a shimmering lake just out of reach, or trees dancing on the horizon where there are none. Your brain, craving relief, tricks you into false hope, a fatal flaw when you're battling thirst and heat stroke. Historians still argue whether these psychological effects contributed to the high number of settlers who simply gave up and turned back, or worse, wandered off in the wrong direction. Temperatures dip very little even after sunset, so the promise of cool nights is a harsh disappointment. Instead of cooling down, your body wrestles with heat exhaustion, leaving you sweaty and restless when you finally dare to sleep under the stars, if you're lucky enough to find a safe spot. And yes, that fan you've switched on back home? Here, the desert wind feels like a blast furnace, not a comforting hum. By the time you push through the golden hours, your clothes stick to your skin, your throat aches with the dryness of ancient bones, and your eyes aren't just tired, they're raw. The sun continues its cruel march across the sky, reminding you relentlessly that the West is not built for the faint-hearted. It's a slow torture made up of heat, dust, and ceaseless pressure on every inch of your body. So next time you think about riding off into the sunset, remember how brutally that sun shines, and why ignoring it could very well be the beginning of the end. As the relentless sun continues its course, the harsh truth about water settles in, a truth that's more terrifying than the heat itself. You think you can just find a clean stream or a watering hole? Think again. Thirst, or rather the unending fight against it, is the real deal-breaker in the Wild West. And no, that dusty trickle you spot in the distance isn't some magical oasis. It could very well be a contaminated, stagnant pool ready to turn your insides against you. Water scarcity was a life-or-death issue. Every drop was precious. You start off hoping the settlers' lore holds true. Follow the buffalo, and you'll find water. But those buffalo herds move seasonally and rapidly, and sometimes they led you straight into dry gulches. There were countless tales of lost travelers who simply ran out of juice, collapsing in the middle of the desert because their bodies couldn't handle the suffering anymore. Historians still argue whether survival was more about knowing the land or sheer stubbornness, but either way, the water dilemma was central. Here's a sobering historical fact. In some years during droughts, entire communities faced forced migration because wells dried up and rivers diverted. Water wagons became lifelines, and access to a dependable spring or river could mean the difference between a bustling settlement and a ghost town. You might find an old canyon stream, but the water isn't as friendly as it looks. It's often contaminated with silt, bacteria, or worse, the leftovers of unfortunate critters who drowned upstream. Drinking untreated water risks dysentery, cholera, and other deadly diseases that could incapacitate you far quicker than a bandit's bullet. And forget the convenience of modern filtration or boiling. That luxury wasn't always an option when your matches were damp or you lacked the fuel to build a fire. For a quirky sidelight, some pioneers resorted to carrying water biscuits, hardtack soaked in whatever water they could find. It was a desperate, chewy strategy to keep hydrated and fed. Imagine biting into something that's half stale cracker, half swamp water. Not exactly the hydration you dreamed of on day one. Another problem lurks in the form of minerals and salts. Some water sources were tough on the kidneys due to high mineral content, causing dehydration's sneaky cousin to set in. Kidney pain and failures that settlers often misunderstood until it was too late. It's why miners, ranchers, and travelers learned to nurse their water carefully, rationing sips and always eyeing the horizon for signs of rain that might refill their canteens. Do you remember the crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier? Well, here's the watery equivalent of desperation. Folks sometimes added charcoal or ash to water to clean it, which could filter some impurities but often left a bitter taste and didn't guarantee safety. The scientific debate at the time was murky, and while some trusted these methods, many simply took their chances, proving again how survival was as much gamble as grit. You struggle to find a spot to refill, but every potential source feels like a double-edged sword. Take a slow sip and your body clings tighter to what little moisture remains, but one infected gulp could spell disaster. Your mouth feels parched, lips cracking, the desert's silent weapon working its magic on you. Holding on to water becomes your first unspoken rule. You might even consider rationing it, swallowing tiny doses just to fool your body into thinking it's got enough to push through. But a subtle, creeping panic grows whenever the canteen runs low. Thirst doesn't always manifest immediately. Sometimes it sneaks up, dulls your senses, and leaves you dangerously confused. So, as you press forward, that chilling thought lingers. In the Wild West, water doesn't just sustain life, it controls it, and without it, you wouldn't just struggle, you'd lose. Fast. You soldier on, your feet sinking into the gritty soil and jagged rocks, kicking up tiny clouds with every step. The landscape isn't just a backdrop, it's a ceaseless challenge. The rough terrain grinds down your boots, bruises your ankles, and pulls at your patience. This isn't a stroll down a city sidewalk. Out here, every mile is an ache, every hill is a hurdle, every valley a trap. You quickly realize that traversing the Wild West isn't about speed, it's about endurance, and your body will rebel before long. Imagine walking for hours under a blistering sun, boots heavy with dust, legs trembling not from exhaustion alone, but from muscles that don't want to cooperate anymore. Those endless vistas that look so picturesque in paintings and films mask the sheer physical punishment the land dishes out. Historians still argue whether many settlers underestimated this grueling aspect before setting out. Spoiler, they did. The terrain itself could switch from loose sand to thorny scrub, to jagged rock formations sharp enough to slice through thin leather. Your every step might involve hopping over prickly cacti, dodging stinging mesquite thorns, or balancing on unstable rocky ledges where one misstep could mean a brutal fall. You realize quickly that shoes weren't just footwear, but a crucial defense mechanism. Yet even the toughest boots had limits, with blisters and puncture wounds, often leading to infections that incapacitated even the strongest. Here's a historical nugget. The challenges of travel forced many to adopt the use of moccasins, or specially crafted leather sandals, by some Native American tribes, which were surprisingly practical for desert landscapes. Settlers who refused to adopt indigenous footwear often paid dearly in sore feet and lost time. This seemingly small choice could mean the difference between reaching shelter or collapsing alone under the merciless sun. Foot troubles weren't the only issue. You carry your gear, your weapon, your meager food, and any water you've managed to gather. The weight drags your shoulders down until they ache, your back stiffens, muscles knot, and your movements grow sluggish. Each breath you take becomes heavier as the altitude and heat conspire to suffocate your stamina. Even your mental state starts cracking. You find your thoughts fogged, vision blurred, a dangerous combination in unfamiliar, hostile territory. But beneath this weariness lurks a stranger challenge, the sheer monotony of the landscape. Stretching plains and barren hills blend into a dull palette of browns and yellows. That endless sameness tricks your brain, distorts your sense of time and distance. You think you're making progress, but the hills ahead remain stubbornly fixed. The horizon barely shifts. This mental fatigue is a sleeper threat, subtle yet deadly. A quirky detail from some frontier diaries tells of travelers counting every rock, every bush, to combat this mental maze. If you don't keep your mind anchored, you risk wandering in circles, a real threat that settlers faced frequently, especially under heat stroke or dehydration. Navigation wasn't just a matter of compass or map, it was a mind game against fatigue and despair. The physical toll of hiking through such harsh terrain meant that many settlers either paused frequently or traveled only during cooler parts of the day and night if they were willing to risk roaming predators and uncertain darkness. The fatigue of daytime travel meant slower progress, which in turn meant more exposure to other dangers. A vicious cycle. So as you bite down on fatigue and keep moving, remember this. The wilderness here mashes your body and mind into submission, slowly grinding you down until you're just another forgotten traveler lost to miles of merciless earth. It's easy to romanticize the West as wide open and free, but in truth, it's a brutal opponent that doesn't care if you make it to sundown. Your boots crush brittle twigs and tumble through thorny brush, awareness kicking in, because out here, the wildlife isn't just scenery, it's an unpredictable adversary. You might think the wild creatures are no more than background noise, but some are downright dangerous. You feel eyes watching from shadowy crevices, and every snap of a twig sets your heart thudding. The Wild West isn't just about bad weather and rough terrain. It's a living, breathing battleground filled with critters that could wreck your day or your life. First off, venomous snakes are a very real hazard. The notorious rattlesnake, with its eerie warning rattle, is no joke. One bite can cause swelling, bleeding, and intense pain. Historians still argue how many settlers truly understood this danger before encountering it. Some thought a quick cut or folk remedies like sucking the poison out would save them. Spoiler, they usually didn't. Without proper antivenom, something only developed much later, you're at serious risk. You might also meet the Arizona black widow spider, whose venom can immobilize you with agonizing muscle cramps. And yes, these creepy crawlies loved hiding in boots, blankets, and corners where you least expect. A bite at night could mean waking up to a nightmare, but sleep deprivation due to fear also made survival harder. The unpredictable nature of such creatures kept settlers perpetually on edge. But there's also the larger wildlife. The mountain lions, wolves, and coyotes skulking through the underbrush. Most of these predators avoided humans, but when desperate hunger kicks in, encounters turn deadly. You probably underestimated how fast and quiet some of these predators could be. Some settlers reported being stalked in their camps, feeling the hover of danger just beyond the firelight. Those uneasy nights made the cracked earth feel even colder. On a quirky note, the infamous jackalope legend, those mythical rabbits with antlers, was a humorous distraction among locals. It didn't exist, obviously, but tall tales like those lightened the mood in a place where humor and hallucination often saved sanity. Sometimes, taking a break from mortal dangers with a good laugh was the best survival tactic. Then there's the scorpion, lurking silently under rocks or in dry wood piles. Historians still debate how widespread deadly scorpion stings actually were, but any prick or sting in a land without immediate medicine was massively serious. Sometimes the smallest creature could deliver the biggest threat. You might think the bigger animals were more dangerous, but often it was the tiny, nearly invisible threats that made your skin crawl and nerves begin to fray. The biting flies, fleas, and lice were relentless, gnawing at your skin, sucking precious blood, and spreading diseases. This constant irritation lowered your morale and left wounds open to infection. So as you navigate through this living maze, every rustle, every shadow, every unexplained noise becomes a puzzle of survival. You learn to spot the snake's rattle, avoid brush that looks suspicious, and sleep with one eye open, no matter how exhausted you feel. The Wild West's wildlife isn't the romanticized horses and open plains type you imagine. It's a gauntlet filled with creatures both small and large, many downright hostile, all part of the daily gamble you take just walking out of your tent, or in your case, the modern comfort zone. You probably never really thought about how many different being-animal threats you'd face, right? Yet, here you are, learning that in the Wild West, wildlife was less about companionship and more about survival hazard number one. When you picture the Wild West, your mind might flash to swift-shooting cowboys and dramatic gunfights under the blazing sun. Movie scenes play out with bullets whizzing and quick draws deciding fates in a flash. But here's a reality check. Those famous shootouts were actually pretty rare and hardly the free-for-all you imagine. If you thought you'd impress with lightning-fast gun skills, think again. The truth of sharpshooting back then was cold, calculated, and frankly, brutal. First, firearms technology wasn't what Hollywood makes it out to be. Early revolvers had limited rounds, could jam, and required slow reloading. Imagine fumbling with tiny clips while someone's aiming straight at you. Historians still argue about how effective those quick-draw duels really were, but the consensus is that most encounters were messy, painful, and often ended with the slower person getting hurt or worse. You wouldn't just need steady hands, you needed patience, nerves of steel, and an understanding that most fights weren't fair one-on-one showdowns. Most violence involved ambushes, group attacks, or shooting from cover where survival meant whatever tactic worked best, not necessarily who was fastest on the draw. An odd fact, some lawmen carried unconventional weapons like blackjacks or brass knuckles, relying on surprise and close-quarters fight tactics rather than guns all the time. This often surprises people who only think of the Wild West as a place ruled by lead and powder. Close combat was common because shooting wasn't always practical or reliable. Another surprising reality was that many gunfighters weren't the sharpest shots. Curiously, some famed shooters built reputations on timing and intimidation rather than consistent accuracy. This contributed to the sudden deaths and wounded survivors who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meanwhile, the infamous dueling style of quick-draw pistols wasn't standardized. There were no rules other than who shot first, usually the one willing to do it quicker and more mercilessly. This chaotic environment led most people to avoid conflict altogether whenever they could. Survival was less about bravado and more about knowing when to disappear, hide, or negotiate. A quirky twist in Wild West gun lore is the tale of sharpshooters who practiced shooting coins off fence posts or cigars held in friends' mouths. While spectacular, this was rare, dangerous, and mostly performed by showmen rather than practical survivors. Most of your chances at survival weren't in exhibitions, but grim skirmishes where you were outnumbered and outgunned. Despite the mythos, few survived gunfights by luck alone. Preparing for battle meant constant vigilance and readiness that drained both physical energy and mental focus. Even the best gunslinger could make one mistake, like forgetting to check if their gun was loaded, and that's all it took. So, while your inner cowboy may dream of epic standoffs and pistol panache, the Wild West's real gunfire stories read more like grim, cautionary tales. You have to respect that the romanticized gunfight was just one small element in a daily grind where survival required far more than just shooting straight. You probably assumed quick reflexes would save you, but as you begin to see, you'd need a whole lot more, plus a generous dose of luck, to survive even a day. The sun dips lower, shadows stretch long across the dusty streets of a frontier town, but don't mistake the fading light for safety. If you think your biggest threat out here is the environment or wild animals, think again. People, the unpredictable, often ruthless humans, pose an equally severe, if not greater, danger. Bandits, outlaws, and desperate drifters hold the Wild West's dark underbelly, and surviving them takes more than quick reflexes. It takes nerves of steel and a keen instinct for danger. Remember those picturesque scenes of town saloons? Behind their swinging doors buzzed not just the sound of laughter, but also whispered deals, grumblings, and brewing conflicts. Law enforcement was patchy, and towns often teetered on the edge of chaos, where the rule of law was as fragile as a cracked whiskey bottle. History tells us that outlaws weren't just gun-toting villains you read about in dime novels. They were often desperate men and women pushed by poverty, revenge, or sheer survival instinct. Many were skilled at hiding in plain sight, biding time to strike when you least expected it. The threat wasn't always an upfront shootout. It could be a silent robbery, a sneaky ambush along a forgotten trail, or a betrayal by someone who pretended to be an ally. An appalling fact: some settlements had more crimes reported per capita than major cities today, yet lacked stable policing. Town marshals or sheriffs might be outnumbered, underpaid, or themselves on the take. Historians debate if chaotic lawlessness defined the West, or if order was slowly established through sheer grit of communities. Either way, you're caught somewhere between. Vigilante justice often filled the gap, sometimes brutally efficient, sometimes wildly unjust. You could easily find yourself accused on flimsy evidence and face swift, grim consequences from mobs who judged faster than they listened. So your survival relies as much on reading people as watching the horizon for dust clouds. A quirky but chilling tidbit: outlaws sometimes sent dead man's messages, bloodied notes pinned to horses or tossed into towns as warnings or ultimatums. Psychological warfare wasn't just modern battlefield strategy. It thrived in the dusty streets and canyon hideouts here. You think you could blend into town unnoticed? It was nearly impossible. Everyone knew each other's faces, rumors traveled faster than the trains, and distrust ran deep. A wrong look, a poorly chosen word, even unfamiliar clothes could mark you as a target. Social survival was a tightrope walk. Being on the road, lone travelers were prime prey. Many fallen victims were found days later, robbed, and sometimes worse. Carrying no weapons wasn't an option, but brandishing them without cause could also ignite deadly conflicts. The balance was precarious at best. So you see, simply arriving in the Wild West didn't guarantee freedom or safety. It almost guaranteed constant alertness and strategic thinking in navigating a world where danger lurked, not just in nature's cruelty, but in the very people you crossed paths with. You probably imagined the West as a land of heroic justice and simple good versus evil. Instead, it's an intricate web of survival where even the best intentions get tangled in suspicion and peril. Your muscles ache, wounds throb, but it's not just scrapes or bruises that threaten your survival. Disease and injury in the Wild West are brutal co-conspirators, turning minor problems into deadly disasters. You think a scrape or a cold wouldn't slow you down. Think again. The lack of proper medical care back then meant every ache and pain carried a shadow of potential disaster. Imagine twisting your ankle on a rocky path miles from help. Without a proper sprain kit, your foot swells agonizingly, threatening infection. Or imagine a small cut. Dirt and germs immediately invade, turning a tiny wound into a festering abscess. Historians still argue exactly how much medical knowledge settlers had access to, but the truth is, even trained doctors were scarce, and many treatments were painfully primitive. Bloodletting, herbal poultices, and leeches were common cures, but often did more harm than good. The germ theory of disease was just gaining ground, so sanitation was poor. Instruments were reused without sterilization, and many believed bad air or evil spirits caused illness. You wouldn't just be unlucky to fall sick, you'd be vulnerable to misguided remedies and folk superstitions. A grim historical fact: childbirth mortality rates in frontier communities were alarmingly high due to lack of trained midwives and sterile conditions, highlighting the everyday peril women faced. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, malaria, and smallpox spread rapidly in mining camps and settlements, often wiping out entire communities before anyone could react. You might suppose a night's rest can fix everything, but sleep was scarce and frequently broken by pain or worries. If you contracted something like pneumonia, the odds were stacked against you. In some towns, doctors were no more than barbers or traveling quacks with rudimentary knowledge. The kind of advanced surgeries or antibiotics you imagine were decades away. Getting infected meant you were often left to your fate. For a quirky but awful tidbit, some settlers used snake oil, literally oils made from snake parts or other bizarre ingredients, as miracle cures. Skeptics famously criticized this snake oil medicine, but desperate people bought into it, sometimes wasting the little money they had on false hope. Accidents were everyday occurrences: burns from cooking over open flames, broken bones from falls or horse riding, gunshot wounds from accidental discharges. Without clean clinics or accessible supplies, infections often meant amputations or slow deaths. The pain alone could break anyone's spirit. So as your body battles minor cuts turning nasty, fever creeping up your spine, and untreated injuries worsening by the day, you realize that survival isn't just about fighting off bandits or beasts. It's a constant war within, against suffering, infection, and the desperate hope that help might be only a few miles away. You're probably thinking today's hospitals and medicine sound like miracles. Out here, miracles were rare, and most people simply prayed to survive. Hunger gnaws at your stomach, an unrelenting reminder that the Wild West doesn't just starve your spirit, it starves your body too. You might imagine the frontier as a land abundant with game and crops, but finding, or more importantly preserving, food was a daily gamble that few won easily. The reality is harsh. You're competing with every animal, battling the elements, and fighting time against spoilage. Out here, food supplies were often meager and heavily reliant on what you could grow, hunt, or trade. Settlers depended on salted meats, dried beans, and hardtack, those famously tough biscuits that could practically break teeth. Historians still argue whether this diet was sustainable long-term or a quick recipe for scurvy and malnutrition. Either way, nutritional deficiencies were a common problem, and those could be just as deadly as a bullet wound. Hunting wasn't for the faint of heart. You needed patience, skill, and the right tools to catch rabbits, deer, or even the occasional bison. But game was scarce in some areas due to overhunting and environmental shifts. As for crops, the dry, unpredictable climate made farming risky, with droughts and locust swarms wiping out entire harvests in a season. Farming failures meant food shortages, rising prices, or worse, starvation. One quirky survival hack settlers often used involved pemmican, a dense, long-lasting food made from dried meat, fat, and berries. While it sounds healthy now, it was a tough, sometimes unpalatable lifeline for traveling hunters or miners. Your mouth would dry out chewing on it, but its calorie richness was a literal lifesaver. Food preservation was a nightmare. Without refrigeration, freshness lasted barely a day or two before rot set in. Salt and smoke curing were popular, but not foolproof. Spoiled rations led to food poisoning, occasionally causing entire traveling parties to fall ill. Historians debate how often these outbreaks influenced westward migration patterns, but evidence suggests starvation and sickness were bedfellows too often. During hard times, some settlers resorted to eating what you might call questionable fare: roots, insects, or even bark. Yup, you heard that right. Desperation made strange diets. Although those folk tales about edible cacti or grubs might lend a survival edge, it's safe to say you wouldn't enjoy the meal much. There's also the constant threat of animal scavengers. Stored food wasn't safe from raccoons, rats, or pack rats eager for an easy midnight snack. That meant constant vigilance, not just hunting for food, but defending it fiercely. On top of the physical hunger, the mental toll of not knowing when you'd eat next weighs heavy. Hunger clouds your judgment, saps energy, and leaves you vulnerable to other dangers like illness or injury. You don't just battle the environment, you battle your own body's shrinking reserves, hoping to stretch every crumb. So, if you thought surviving in the Wild West was about having a holster and a horse, think better. Without the right food and knowledge to find or preserve it, you'd give up long before sundown. The land might seem full, but for your stomach, it's a cruel irony, a vast emptiness that keeps biting back. You mount your horse, convinced the trusty steed will be your savior on this ragged journey, but reality swiftly clips that hope. Managing a horse in the Wild West isn't as simple as climbing up and urging it forward. These animals are as much survivors as you, with their own quirks and demands, and if you thought you'd just ride out of trouble, think again. Handling horses requires knowledge, patience, and skill, or you might find yourself stranded on foot. For starters, horses need water and rest, just like you, and the dry lands often offered neither. You can't just gallop off endlessly hoping the horse will keep pace without faltering. A dehydrated or exhausted horse becomes useless, or worse, a liability. Historians still argue whether early settlers truly understood equine care or underestimated how quickly horses could fail, leaving travelers walking hundreds of miles. Feeding your horse could be as tricky as feeding yourself. Grazing pastures were rare in many parts, meaning you either carried extra feed or risked letting your horse starve. Worse, poor quality feed could make them sick. Horses weakened by hunger or heat stroke simply collapse, and without them, your mobility plummets. There's also the danger of barren and unpredictable trails. Horses might spook at rattlesnakes, skitter on loose gravel, or panic near steep cliffs. Controlling a frightened horse could become a battle on its own, one that often ended with broken limbs, missed footing, or worse. If your horse bolts or rears, you're in serious trouble. An interesting yet little-known fact: many settlers and cowboys learned the art of horse whispering, calming and communicating with horses through subtle cues. This wasn't just showmanship, but often the difference between survival and disaster. But mastering this subtle language took years, and most newcomers were clueless beginners. Traveling long distances meant caring not only for the horse, but also managing your gear. Saddles could chafe, stirrups break, and leather straps snap under constant strain. One torn strap or one uncomfortable saddle could mean the difference between a smooth ride and a bumpy, painful ordeal. Your patience is tested by both the animal and the equipment. Then there's the constant threat of theft. Horses were coveted assets, and losing one to a horse thief or marauder could leave you completely stranded with no quick replacement, especially far from towns. A quirky survival tale involved some settlers using bells or colored ribbons on horses to discourage theft. But these methods were only mildly effective and sometimes backfired by making horses easier targets. So, as you mount your steed, remember you're not just riding off into the sunset. You're entering a complex partnership where both your lives depend on countless small actions and decisions. Underestimating the horse's needs or temperament was a mistake no one could afford, and poor horsemanship meant walking miles you never planned for. If your hopes rested on riding your way out of danger or distance, think again. Without the right knowledge and care, that noble horse might just become another obstacle on your long road to survival. You might think the Wild West was a free-for-all where the strongest and loudest ruled, but surviving here wasn't just about muscle or firearms. It was a delicate dance of social codes and politics that could mean life or death. You step into towns where every handshake and sidelong glance carries weight. One wrong move, a poorly chosen word, or a misunderstood gesture could turn neighbors into enemies in an instant. Navigating this complex social web was as vital as dodging rattlesnakes or managing thirst. You quickly learned that honor wasn't just an abstract idea, it was a currency. Duels and disputes followed unspoken rules, and breaking them could result in exile or worse. Historians still argue to what extent frontier justice was fair versus arbitrary, but anyone caught violating local codes often found themselves swiftly punished outside any legal system. Your reputation mattered here. Word traveled fast, and stories about you spread like wildfire, both true and twisted. If you gained a reputation for being tough, but fair, you might survive. But if rumors painted you as a cheat, a coward, or a threat, You'd struggle to find allies or even a friendly face. Trust was hard won and easily lost. An interesting fact is that some towns had social compacts, unwritten laws about behavior, dress codes, or trade etiquette. Violating these could mean being barred from saloons, trading posts, or even basic services, and without such access, survival became infinitely harder. You also navigate a society deeply influenced by cultural clashes. Settlers, Native Americans, immigrants, and freed slaves all inhabited the West, each bringing different traditions and expectations. Understanding these dynamics and respecting or exploiting them was a survival skill. Many newcomers failed spectacularly, alienated by ignorance or arrogance. At the saloon or trading post, it wasn't just about drinks or goods. It was a battlefield of words, alliances, and sometimes cold stares that could escalate into violence. Remember, one too many jokes about someone's background or political leanings could spark a knife fight or a deadly brawl. Here's a quirky but important detail. Some communities used coded language or symbols, like porch decorations or hat feathers, to signal allegiance, warning, or peace. This delicate communication kept many safe by sending subtle messages without drawing hostile attention. You begin to realize that survival here means sharpening social instincts, learning when to speak and when to stay silent. While you might have prepared for gunfire and beasts, the human game is ever shifting and often more dangerous than a rattlesnake strike. You probably thought the West was a raw land of rugged individuals, but it was a place ruled by complex rules, social strategies, and unspoken alliances. Mastering these codes was not optional, it was essential. As the sun sets and darkness sifts into the valleys, your fight doesn't end, it shifts. Nightfall in the Wild West brings a fresh layer of peril, and if you thought the day's trials were bad, wait until the moon rises. You try to find somewhere to rest, but the landscape feels altogether different. Silence stretches unnerving, broken only by distant howls or the crackle of dry brush. Sleeping outdoors becomes a gamble more dangerous than any shootout. You fumble to set up a camp, knowing full well that sleep might betray you. Predators aren't just stories. Mountain lions, wolves, and coyotes prowl near settlements and trails alike, eyes glinting in the dark, scenting an easy meal. People sometimes used dogs for protection, but not everyone had one, and even then, your canine friend couldn't guard against every stealthy threat. Historians still argue whether true safety was ever possible once night cloaked the land. There's a reason many travelers preferred to travel by day, hiding in the shadows of dawn and dusk when temperatures eased, but dangers lurked less visibly. You might try lighting a fire for warmth and protection, but fires attract attention, unwanted eyes from humans or curious animals. Balancing light and concealment is a tricky game, and a blazed campfire can double as a beacon for trouble. Sleep itself is a challenge. Fear keeps your muscles tense and your senses sharp. Even when you drift off, fleeting nightmares or the slightest noise jerk you awake. That exhaustion piles on, but constant vigilance postpones rest like a cruel punishment. Another tough reality. Weather didn't care it was nighttime. Temperatures could plummet sharply, especially in the desert where heat drained fast without the sun's rays. You shiver inside your thin blanket, wishing you could trade places with the land's resilient creatures. A quirky, yet haunting frontier story tells of travelers tied to their wagons or horses at night to keep them close, lessening the chance of theft or escape. Being tethered was a double-edged sword, less freedom to flee, but a better chance of rescue if something went wrong. You also grapple with insects, nighttime swarms of mosquitoes and no-see-ums that leave itching marks and drain your already low energy. It's a buzzing, biting discomfort added to the overall misery. So, as the stars wheel overhead and darkness thickens, you realize that nightfall isn't a relief. It's a new battlefield. The West never sleeps, and neither can you, if you want to see sunrise again. You probably assumed nights brought rest and comfort. Instead, they bring a silent terror that gnaws at your will to survive. You think the land was only dangerous during your long, grueling days or restless nights? Think again. The Wild West had its own brand of natural disasters that showed up without warning, turning survival into a test of quick reflexes and calm nerves. You quickly learn that apart from heat, predators, and bandits, nature itself throws hazards your way, often with lethal consequences. Flash floods, for example, could come roaring through narrow canyons without much warning. One minute, dry creek beds are quiet and empty. The next, torrents of muddy water sweep down with a force that could tear through camps and sweep away anything or anyone in its path. Settlers were terrified of these sudden floods, as they often destroyed homes, drowned livestock, and turned travel routes into death traps. Historians debate whether flash floods were responsible for more casualties than gunfights during certain seasons, but the impact was undeniable. Then there were wildfires. Dry brush and scorching heat combined to create wildfire conditions that settlers closely feared. When these blazes ignited, they spread rapidly, leaving scorched earth and helpless refugees in their wake. Some areas were abandoned entirely until the land healed. Survival sometimes meant racing through choking smoke, stifling heat, and falling embers, all while hope for safe passage flickered. Add into the mix blinding sandstorms, where thick clouds of fine dust and grit slice into your skin and choke your lungs. These events could last hours or days, burying landmarks and erasing any sense of direction. You dig in and hope to wait it out, but waiting out a storm in open land feels like daring nature's wrath head-on. Scholars still argue how much these storms shaped migration, but their destructive potential was clear. A quirky but true tidbit. Some settlers observed how lightning storms in that dry land sometimes ignited fires far from their strikes, leading to widespread conflagrations days after the storm passed. It made even a passing rainstorm something to watch with wary eyes. You also face sudden freezing nights where hypothermia could sneak in, particularly in spring or fall when temperatures plunged fast. Inexperienced settlers were caught unprepared, wrapped only in thin clothes or flimsy blankets, and didn't survive the cold that came in like a silent thief. Over time, you grasped that the Wild West's unpredictability wasn't just environmental noise. It was an invisible monster lurking in every breeze, every rustle, every cloud formation. You can't plan for some disasters, and what you thought was a safe path one day might vanish the next in flame or flood. You probably imagined nature as breathtaking but stable, beautiful to admire. Instead, it's a volatile, unyielding force, always ready to remind you who's boss. So here you are, all the challenges of the Wild West lined up like relentless opponents ready to knock you down. Now, imagine facing all of these in a single sun-scorched, dust-blown day, and you start to see why survival wasn't just difficult. It was near impossible. By sundown, you'd be a soaked mess of sweat, dust, bruises, hunger, and exhaustion, your body and mind stretched to breaking. You've battled heat that drains every drop of energy, thirst that claws at your throat with dry ferocity, and wild terrain that punishes every step you take. You've stared down venomous snakes, dodged predators, and navigated a world where bandits lurk in every shadow. Your stomach grumbles from scarce and questionable food, and your trusty horse, your hope for swift escape, is as worn and strained as you are. If injuries haven't slowed you, disease and poor medical knowledge threaten to undo you quietly but swiftly. To rest without fear of night prowlers or brutal weather feels like a luxury out of reach. Social dynamics demand you tread lightly, weaving through a complex web of unseen rules. And just when you think you've caught a breath, nature itself presses down with flash floods, wildfires, or blinding storms. Historians still argue whether it was the environment, human conflict, or sheer bad luck that accounted for the most hardships. But the facts are clear. Surviving even one day here was an epic feat. You'd need a mix of cunning, knowledge, willpower, and luck that few possessed. The romantic myths of the Wild West, full of quick gunshots and gold-rich promise, barely scratch the surface of this harsh reality. You probably thought you'd at least make it to sunset without falling apart. But as we've traveled through heat, dust, danger, and fear together, it's plain to see. This ruthless land earned its legendary reputation by claiming the unprepared and the unlucky. Still, even though you likely wouldn't survive a day here, the Wild West's harshness shaped legends, inspired stories, and left a mark on history that echoes to this day. It challenges us to remember that behind every daring cowboy or pioneering woman was an incredible battle against a wild and unyielding world. So next time you binge a Western, remember all the sweat, fear, and grit nobody shows on screen, and appreciate just how tough it was to live even a single day in the Wild West. Word count 172. Awaiting final wind-down request or further instructions. Now, as we gently close this window into the harsh world of the Wild West, let's slow down the pace and soften the edges of this rugged tale. Imagine yourself settling into a quiet evening where the blazing sun has dipped beneath the dusty horizon, leaving behind a balm of fading warmth and twinkling stars. Breathe in slowly, feeling the weight of the day ease from your shoulders. The wind, though once harsh and cutting, now hums a gentle lullaby, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. Let your mind wander softly to wide-open spaces where time feels suspended between the earth and endless sky, a place where every challenge, every hardship, and every soul had their story quietly woven into the landscape. You may still carry the image of relentless sun, biting dust, and unseen dangers near, yet know that here, in this calm moment, peace wraps around you like a soft, worn blanket. The world has shifted, the hard edges smoothened by distance and understanding. Each breath you take untangles the tension a little more, and the fierce grip of survival stories gently loosens. Rest here, in the quiet company of the past, knowing you've taken a journey few could endure. The echoes of that wild time fade softly into whispers, and your own heartbeats slow to a steady, calm rhythm. The Wild West was a place of extremes, but now, in this space, it becomes a softer memory, a tale to ponder and admire from the safety of your own restful night. So, as your eyelids grow heavy and the night deepens all around, carry with you the resilience of those who fought the raw land and the gentle reminder that you too can endure by simply breathing, resting, and dreaming beyond the dust. Sleep well, wrapped in the twilight hush of a world long gone, but never quite forgotten.